Welcome back to Switch to Linux. We are going to have another look at our first things first. I don't have my classic Switch to Linux shirt on. I had left it at home, but I had to record the video today or not at all. So what we want to do is continue in on our book on first things first. So last time, if you remember, we talked about the urgency addiction. And this is that drive that really pushes us toward just always doing these urgent things, whether they're important or unimportant. Usually in our modern society, these are becoming very unimportant things. And this is why you should always turn off your notifications on your phones, your devices, maybe even your email notifications, because otherwise what happens is every time that phone beeps, just because, Switch to Linux updates a video does not mean that's your ultimate priority right now. And that would go with anything you're following. For sure, leave text messages and phone calls up, especially, particularly if you use those for an emergency thing. In my case, I only text with like 3 or 4 people, and it's not like an urgency thing, but it's not people who disrespect my time. And so I want to make sure that I'm not getting notifications all over the place, because you know how we are. With that phone beeps, you want to pick it up. And that means that whatever that beep is, whether it's an uploaded video or a new email, that has become the urgent priority for you right now. And we want to get away from doing that. We want to schedule our time with our unimportant things. And that's one of those things that this book is written, way before cell phones and all these instant notifications. And so a lot of their things that they're talking about as being not important and not urgent are now moving from quadrant 4 to quadrant 3 items, not important but urgent things. And as our life lives in urgency, we gain this urgency addiction, and that is a challenge. And so chapter 3 is called To Live, to Love, and to Learn to Leave a Legacy. And this is really about that fourth dimension. So if you remember, the first chapter of this book talked about the various generations of time management, where you're doing checklists, or maybe intense schedules, or maybe advanced schedules, calendars, and planners. And you see a lot of people with these types of advanced schedules, calendars, planners, and then what ends up happening invariably is you become a slave to the schedule, and people fall off the priority of the list. And so what we need to figure out is what these authors come up with is what they call the fourth generation, which is a system that has the efficiency of that level 3, with a lot of schedules, plans, a lot of focus on what is important in life, but what it doesn't have is the tendency to put people to the back burners, to the schedule. And that's kind of what you need to look at. And so they look at 3 what they call the 3 fundamental ideas that empower us. So the first idea is the fulfillment of 4 human needs and capabilities. The second is the reality of what is called true north principles. And the third is the potentiality of the 4 human endowments. Okay, so we basically, as people, we have 4 real needs, and this is that first principle. What are these 4 needs? We have physical needs, we have social needs, we have mental needs, and we have spiritual needs. And we need to keep all of these things in some degree of balance. If we're so spiritual on one hand, we can become no earthly good. And so that's one of those things to keep in mind, is that we don't want to be focusing so much on the spiritual side that we leave everything else behind. But our mental state is very important as well. We cannot neglect reading and building up ourselves and our minds, because otherwise we'll become weak in that area. Our physical strengths, if you live your whole life on fast food with no exercise, no diet, no health, you're going to wear out way faster than you should, because you do not have the good health and the good nutrition. So that's part of that physical. I think possibly some of the physical and some of the social is good, appropriate physical touch. And so you have a degree of that. And of course, the social, we all have a degree of an element of social. And that's one of the things that's kind of getting worse in our culture now, as people gravitate more towards the online things rather than the offline things. But regardless, you should have a time when you can put down your devices, you can put down your computers, and you can actually spend time with real people. That might just be 1 or 2 people, that might be whole groups of people. That depends on whether you are an introvert or an extrovert. But even an introvert needs to have some good friends from time to time. And so when you can combine and get good at all 4 of those simultaneously, you have a very good, healthy spiritual life. You're mentally growing. You're taking care of your physical needs, and you have some social circle to you. What ends up happening is you will become a person that kind of you synergize up to a point where you can really become successful. Now, the second thing they talk about is the reality of the true north principles. So if you are a religious person, you would see this as the morality imputed by your God, or whatever you would say that. In the Christian view, we have, for example, a verse in Joel, and it says, "I've written my law on their hearts." That's that type of thing we're talking about. C.S. Lewis, of course, the great Christian apologist, comes in and he'll talk about we all have this morality inside of us that where does this come from? And this is one of his apologetical arguments to say that, yeah, there's a God because of that. Now, whether or not you agree with the Christian ideology or some other religious ideology that says that there is some directionality you need to go to, even if you don't believe in any of that, we all still have some basic moral principles inside of us. We can generally, unless we're crazy psychopaths, we can generally agree that to hurt a child is bad. We can generally agree that murder is bad. And we generally have an understanding that stealing is bad. And so we have this true north. Now, like the 12 steps programs will talk about this higher power, this reliance on this higher power. And so what ends up happening with that is, whether or not you believe it is the Christian God, some other God, or at least just something outside your control, there is some higher power out there that will guide you. And that's what they're talking about with our true north principles. So that's compatible with any religious system, and it's compatible with no religious system as well. All right, so that's kind of what they're talking about. They're not talking about specific values. They're not talking about specific practices. Basically, they go through here to kind of reject the idea that they're specifically talking about this religious faith or that religious faith. Okay, and then what ends up happening? Let's see. Flip down to the next part. Okay, so then we talk about the four endowments, the four human endowments. So these are kind of those four things that really help us out. And if you can, and they have a little survey quiz in here where you can take that and determine where you are. And what they call their four human endowments are your self-awareness. Like, how aware are your surroundings? Now, in my background, I came from a really dysfunctional background, so I actually have what is called hypervigilance, and I've never bothered to deal with it because I love it. It's just the ability to just spot so many things around me, being so observant of the world that I can see little social cues, I can see little societal cues, I can see a lot of things. It's just kind of a part of what's grown in me, and I like that ability. So, like, my self-awareness is through the chart, because I'm aware of myself and the world around me. The next area is the level of the conscience. Now, if you are a person who's fallen into addictions, you fall into problems and challenges, the conscience gets eroded away. The conscience is kind of like this megaphone, that external thing that yells at us from that true north principle to say, hey, what's going on here? And as you violate the conscience, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and then eventually it's there. You've just learned to tune it out, and that's when you get to a dangerous point in your life. The independent will. This is the ability to just act, and it's not just to act based upon what society wants you to out. There is a bull thistle right here, and so if I go down, I hit it. These guys here are quite spiny plants. It's actually a survival plant, though. You can squeeze a lot of water out of these if you're in a survival situation, but it's also full of spikes and thorns. But the independent will is to function independent of society, independent of what everyone wants to say. It's not a rebellious thing, but it's a thing that says, I'm going to evaluate what all these things say, and I'm going to make up my decisions based upon those. And so that's kind of what the independent will is. And then the last one is the creative imagination. This one I'm not the greatest at, but the creative imagination is just, do you sit down and visualize ways that might launch you on further down the directions you want to go? And the example they use in here, of course, being a book from the 90s, they use the old TV show MacGyver that many of my younger audience probably has never heard of. But check out some of those MacGyver shows. You get this guy, he's got no weapons or anything, but he's this genius. He can get out of any situation making bombs out of coconuts, And so really interesting stuff. That's kind of what they use. And so what they wanted to do here, and I think the most important takeaway from this chapter is understand there's that true north. Understand that we have the physical needs, the mental needs, the spiritual needs, and the social needs. But really the most important thing is to develop those self-endowments, because if your self-endowments are in line, you will build yourself up to the point where the whole world may leave you behind, but you have the ability to live one more day. If you live one more day, you can fight one more day, you have one more day to live. And so they give you they give you a tip here, but then they give you some tips and some strategies to help develop these. And as I look through this, of course, I've read this book, I don't know, 3 or 4 times now. And so I've really incorporated a lot of these things into my daily life. And so I'm really understanding it. And that's kind of who I am. It's just the fact that how many good books I read and I put things into practice. I don't necessarily put everything into practice, but let me read you what their ideas are to build up and nurture these 4 self-endowments. The first self-endowment is the self-awareness. The best thing you can possibly do for self-awareness is to keep a journal. Now, you might write, in my case, a lot of my more difficult life circumstances are embedded in some of the most cryptic and metaphoric poetry you'd ever read in your life. And so I know the meaning, but the chance of somebody else stumbling upon the meaning is pretty slim. But at least I know the meaning, and I can go back and revisit that because it gives me something to say, this is where you came from, and I know where you can now go. And that's kind of that really important point. Okay, but keeping a journal in general, whether you call it a diary, whether you call it a journal, just write down your life circumstances and issues. And if you can do this every day, just smaller entries every day, that's awesome. If you do it, once or twice a week, larger entries, that's awesome. Just do something so that you can grow, because I can look back over my years, and there's years I have consistently kept a journal daily or weekly, and there's years that I haven't. And the years that I've kept a journal daily or weekly, I've always done better than the days that I have not. And so keeping that journal will help nurture that self-awareness to see where you are and where you came from. Now, as far as your conscience, okay, you want to learn to listen to and respond to your conscience. Okay, so the conscience, especially if you've come out of a circumstance of addictions or of a circumstance of a lot of bad behavior, maybe you got out of prison, whatever else. I'm right here in central Pennsylvania. We have an expression, whether you come from Penn State or the state pen, right? Because, the state penitentiary is right down the street too. Got the university a couple miles this way. I got the state pen a couple miles this way, And so what you need to do, no matter that circumstance, is you need to learn to listen to the conscience and respond to it. Okay, after you've numbed your conscience and you come back to the point where you can now listen to your conscience, that's a victory. But then as you develop your conscience, as you develop thinking about that more and more, then it will guide you. And remember, the conscience is generally pointing you towards the true north positions. Now, there are times, I will warn, there are times, depending on your family situations and how you grew up, there are times that your conscience may point you to a twisted family past, like deep rules and regulations that are not necessarily good for life. You need to be aware of that, but for the most part, your conscience will generally point you in a good direction. Okay, so here is actually some of the ways that they talk about being able to develop your conscience. Reading and pondering over good wisdom literature, so whether that is, if you're from the Christian or even the Jewish perspective, the Psalms and the Proverbs are a great place to study. You can also, though, the only reason I would ever read a nonfiction book or maybe even look at watch certain movies is simply to garner the moral lesson out of it. Sometimes it puts you into a circumstance where you're not quite sure how you want to react or interact in the middle of all of that. Now, standing apart from and learning from your own experiences, look back and go, yeah, that was a stupid idea. Let's not do that again. Carefully observing the experiences of others. A fool will never learn from his mistake. An intelligent man will learn from his mistakes. A wise man will learn from someone else's mistakes. So read books, learn about other things. And if you can learn great moral lessons from a fictional story, nobody had to get hurt in the process. Okay, that's a good thing to do. Taking time, be still. And those are kind of those ideas. Now, he quotes some C.S. Lewis in here, and I love this. So C.S. Lewis says, disobedience to the conscience makes the conscience blind. There's actually a couple more quotes from this section I really love. As we connect to the wisdom of the ages and the wisdom of the heart, we become less functional in the social mirror and more a person of character and conscience. Our security doesn't come from the way people treat us or in comparing ourselves to others. It comes from basic integrity. Remember that a lot of society wants to push us away from things of integrity, and it's important that we maintain that integrity in our life. Oftentimes, our conscience is a way better mirror of our integrity than is the social world around us, and we need to keep that in mind. Now, nurturing independent will. So the independent will is the ability to live a life kind of integrity, to live a life that is appropriate. And what they talk about here is practice this art by keeping and making promises. And so you do not want to become a person who doesn't keep their promises. And it sometimes can start just by building this up by yourself a little bit. Like if you have the habit of not keeping promises, slowly build yourself up by keeping very small, fairly easy to keep promises first to yourself. And then once you build up enough promises to yourself, you'll notice that your social world around you will actually start to get better as well. And then develop your creative imagination through visualization. So put yourself in your mind in some really weird circumstance and then figure out what it's actually going to take to get over that circumstance. That's what we're talking about there. Just how develop this just through some visualization techniques, whether that be silently meditating or just sitting there. Because if you remember from our last book, the power of focus, one of those principles they really said is deeply important is the ability to sit there and to focus, right? Like to think. Just take some time to think. This ties right into that. Take some time to think. Think about circumstances. Think about what you could possibly do to make things in your life better. Think about the challenges you have and come up with 3 or 4 possible solutions, and then work every one of those solutions out in your mind, and then see if that helps you along the way. So once you have understood your these 4 human endowments, now we are kind of at a threshold to understand what they call the 4th generation, which has that efficiency of keeping the schedules, keeping the calendars, but always keeping the most important things where they should be, which are the first things. So that is our basic summary of chapter 3. We will move into organizing process next time. So until then, thanks for watching. Again, if you want to help support this channel, you can check out Patreon, patreon.com/TomM, or there is a link to that and a link to Amazon down below. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.